Welcome back to the Backseat Startup Podcast with your host, Andrew Hutton.
All right. Welcome back, everyone, to the Backseat Startup Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Hutton, and I am joined today by Karishma Bali, co-founder of Drip, which is a wearable tech product that is serving the hydration market needs for athletes. And I'm super pumped to talk about someone who's building in hardware. And so this is going to be a really fun conversation all around. Karishma, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Really excited to be here, and thanks for having me.
Of course. So let's do what we do. I want to let everyone in the audience get to know you a little bit before we dive into the fun side of our pod and we go share some wisdom. But tell everyone about Drip. What is Drip? What are you doing? Give us the elevator pitch. What's the startup?
Yeah, so Drip is a sports tech company building in performance. We are building products that optimize performance at the physiological level. Our first product is a hydration monitoring wearable that goes in your clothes. What that means is we've made a small sensor that measures how salty your sweat is and goes directly in your clothes, and gives you insights on how to replenish and refuel with that data.
I love it. You started me at the top. I could tell that was practice. Sports tech. We know where you're playing. You're not just a hydration monitor. You're performance gear wearable. I love the ambition. I could just read it between the lines. There's going to be more down the road. But hydration monitoring sounds really interesting. I'm aware of I know there's probably like a whole universe of way less known products that the super athletes use. There's obviously the Whoops and the Garments and stuff. Like, where do you fit in that universe when in terms of like this kind of product? Is this like a consumer product? Is this like a hyper professional thing? Like, how are you thinking about this product, and like who uses this? Maybe that's a better way to ask that.
Yeah, for sure. So we fall into like the wearable IoT category. So we are in the same category as like a Whoop, a Garmin, a Fitbit, heart rate monitor, Apple Watch, the list goes on. But we are starting kind of at the high performing, competitive, and elite athlete hub. We found that a product like this tends to provide the most value first for like the competitive athlete kind of market. So for that reason, we are starting with D1 universities and preparing for a launch first with them. And simultaneously, we're building up some partnerships with some elite professional hubs as well. So kind of like working with them and then kind of working in a couple phases to then roll this out to the everyday kind of consumer, someone who maybe works out a few times a week, who's interested in biometric tracking, who maybe owns a Whoop, Garmin, Fitbit, the list goes on.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe running marathons. You're no stranger to the athletics world. So tell us a little bit of your background. Where does this idea come from? Why are you thinking about this at this point anyway?
Yeah, for sure. I love to say, oh my God, you can tell I've been pitching and talking to VCs, but I'd say I have, a pretty strong founder market fit or founder solution fit. I would literally be the consumer for what I'm building. And I am. So long story short, was training for a marathon back in the day. Not that long ago. Was training for a marathon. Got to a point where I almost passed out due to dehydration. That race was not my first rodeo. I was frustrated that with all the biometrics you can track with today's wearables, that hydration monitoring kind of falls under the cracks. And something that most people don't realize is that hydration is actually one of the most underrated aspects of performance. And you only start paying attention to it when it affects other parts of your life. It's super, super similar to like the sleep industry. Obviously, when you have problems, then it starts, provoking you to make some changes in your life. Same with hydration. People often get to a point of having migraines, passing out to dehydration, having their muscles cramp up, getting super fatigued, realizing they don't have that much energy, and they're like slurring their words. And they're like, oh, maybe I should get up and actually start paying attention to this. So that's what we're looking to change.
You framing it like that just got my mind going, because I would imagine that any serious athletes or anyone at a university playing, D1 athletics or obviously any professional sport obviously thinks and cares all ton about this, right? Like, and they have coaches and they have physios and everybody, right? Who like cares about every part of their recovery. That's like kind of the cool part of like modern sports science, right? Is like the
Yeah.
recovery and everything that. So, and again, like I watch the documentaries and I see the players wearing those heart rate monitors. And I absolutely, so this fits into that construct for me. Like every major professional sports person should be having something like this. But then I think about what you just said is like, we've gotten to the point where we like gamified our sleep with like our whoops and our 8 sleeps and stuff like that. There's every single one of those people probably is dying to gamify their, their steps, their sleep, and now they're drinking, right? And
Yeah.
oh my goodness, this is that feels big. That's really so tell us about where Drip is in the journey, right? Now that I've got like the same level of ambition that you do, this is going to take over the world. Where are you in the early getting it off the ground days?
Yeah, for sure. So we do have an MVP for both the hardware and our software. Super excited about that. We have already launched, what I shouldn't say launched, we've already conducted like our first like beta studies in lab with athletes. And what I mean by that is people on stationary bikes, stationary bikes and treadmills, playing pickleball, tennis, outdoor running, that sort of thing. And now we're gearing up to launch our massive beta with a D1 university down south. And our goal with that is really to get kind of a controlled test in and get a lot of feedback from a lot of very different athletes. We're super excited to start seeing some other like differentiating points too. We're already seeing trends based off of like gender is huge, height, weight, age, geographic location. But now we're excited to throw in some like ethnic studies in the mix too and see if that has any differentiating effects. So getting ready to do that and launch that.
I can just see this in the hands of those physios and those sports scientists and people trying to get the max out of their day in their life. And even if it's just, prosumers correcting their habits, or it's, these super athletes, people at the like leading edge of sport and athletics, just optimizing, right? If you're giving them tools, they're gonna buy it up. They're gonna eat it up. This is really exciting. So it's real. It's in studies, or you're refining it, but there's a way to. No, you can't get your hands on it yet. This is a little too early for that, but there's a way to pre-order it, right? There's a way to get your. Well,
yeah.
Here, we'll make sure you can get your call to actions at the end, so everyone knows where to find you. So this is really cool. Let me ask you one question before we go into our second half. Last question, which is, what's been hard about hardware? That's kind of like the most common cliche. I've worked on hardware startups very infrequently because they're so stinking hard, but I'm close enough to have felt the pain. How has that been for you? Is this your first foray into hardware, and what's it been like building a hardware startup?
So yes and no. I'll answer your first question and then share about previous experience with hardware. The hardest part of building a hardware company is the fact that it's hardware. When you're raising capital, people don't want to touch it. At least raising capital in the Midwest, a lot of people tend to turn it down. And trust me, I get it. When you're building something at the earliest stages, hardware can be risky. But even when we've been building out, we've been very, very frugal in how many units we produce. We don't waste anything that's produced and that's like able to work, both from the hardware and kind of the clothing perspective as well. So it's put to use somewhere. But I'd say that's probably one of the most challenging things is, trying to raise capital for people who don't quite understand hardware. So we have pivoted the strategy a bit more, looking strictly in the performance space, and kind of tapping out of the Midwest as well. The second question I think you asked, is this the first time I'm building something hardware? So no, I am still involved in a very, very small capacity. I had the opportunity to work with NASA's startup studio a few years back, and basically got hired on a team of founders to commercialize technology that was created for the International Space Station for application on ground. So that was very large hardware, and it's a very unsexy industry. HVAC, air ventilation, but was really important, 2020, when everyone was trying to think about how do we get back into office, how do you get back into school. So we found a good trend for that to kind of pick up. And I think the nature of entry point and testing for that was a much more different than this, but long-winded answer, not the first time doing something in
But
hardware.
I'm sure there's similarities, or at least you got the bug. I was going to say, if you've done it before and you're doing it again, you must be a little crazy. But maybe no, it's the opposite. It's the fact that you figured a few things out, or I have this thesis, and maybe you can, I don't know if VCs take this, but like the difficulty, the challenge is the way. Like the moat is in how hard it is, right? Hardware is hard, and that's good, right? And we could probably riff on this all night, because venture capital is really built for these like moonshot ideas, these things where capital intensivity is a big deal, things where there probably is a winner take all, right? Or there's dynamics like that, right? Which hardware can have, right? So I think it creates for like many VCs who are probably tourists and don't really know what they're talking about and will play ball, but I think real VCs. So anyway, we could talk on actually. So we're gonna jump into our second half. Sorry to so here's what we're gonna do, everybody. I'm using this as a segue, a rather poorly worded one. So we're gonna do what we do in the second half of all of our segments of all of our pods is we're gonna jump over to the Wild West that is Reddit. I've already scrolled through all of the riffraff that came up at the top of the subreddit startups, the R Startup subreddit, and I found somebody asking about fundraising.
Oh God.
And I wouldn't normally go here because not everybody is fundraising, but you've mentioned VC a time or two. I think your head is in the game. And we haven't talked about fundraising too much on the Backseat Startup podcast, but it's just in so many people's minds, whether they should or shouldn't be fundraising. That's obviously a big question. So we're going to do this question itself, which is how to find investors, but that's not really the whole thing, right? There's many more aspects to fundraising, and maybe we can pick off a few of them in giving some advice and learning from experience. And so let's see, this person's saying, my co-founder and I made some serious milestones. That's really cool. We're looking to kick off a seed rounds, I think is what they mean. What's the best way to get warm connections? Let's answer that question on the face of it, and then we'll take the thread wherever it goes. How are you finding investors? How have you found investors? Or just to answer the question, what are some of the best ways that you've been either used or been told to use to find these connections to investors? Because if you can't find them, you can't raise from them. So how do you start into this one?
So, okay, let me see if I can keep this concise, but also adding the most amount of value. So this is the first round of funding that we're raising. Quick backstory. I had a different company called Pulse Athletic Apparel that I launched to bootstrap this company. So we use all that revenue to bootstrap this. And now we're at a point where we do need funding to be able to get to the next level. So that's where we're at now. And it's been quite a lengthy process. You'll hear all these things saying like the market isn't where it should be. It's more challenging to raise. A lot of the funds are kind of like doubling down on existing portfolio companies. So how do you reach out as a startup to an investor for the first time? One of the most underrated aspects that I think need to be talked about more about fundraising, especially the first time founder looking to raise a round of capital, is building your network, but doing it in a very intentional way. If I were to go back, like all the way back before starting, I would have deliberately found someone at like a hardware or wearable company. So at like a Whoop, at a Garmin, at a Fitbit, and kind of worked with them as like a mentor, not just from building, but from like the funding perspective as well. So I'd say if you do have a very good idea of what you're building in, what your industry is, what your market is, I'd say very early on, find someone at probably like 20 years ahead of you, age-wise, company-wise, however you interpret that, and see if they'd be open to mentoring you. Because what'll happen is, one, you're not just gonna like sharpen the skills that you need to grow that company, but you're also going to grow your network, because their network will inevitably become your network as well. And that's one of the most powerful things.
Yeah.
The second piece of that.
I love that. That is That is so,
Go ahead.
I just want to comment real fast, because that is awesomely specific. And I've never heard that. I've obviously heard like variations of that, but that's so, so good. Can I throw a thought I've had for a long
Yeah.
time? I wrote a newsletter now like a few months ago. And I think one of the main pieces of advice, it was basically like my brain dump on fundraising. And one of the primary pieces of advice, I think was closer to the top, was fundraise before you need to fundraise. And what I meant by that was like a pithy little way to say, like, you have to get way ahead of it, because when you need these things, it takes years probably to build the relationships and the reputation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of ways to slice that, but it's the same. It's baked. Your tactic is way more. Your advice is way more tactical than my kind of broader premise, right? But it's a long game, and if you haven't started years ago, and you're like coming up against the moment right now, there's probably some intractable challenges that you're about to face, right? It is, man, there's just so many layers to this. So that was such a good word. Get way ahead of it. Okay, give me your second advice, and then we'll keep riffing. This is good.
For sure. No, and like you're like spot on about that too. The second is so depending on city, and again, I think I'm gonna get a lot of shit if Midwestern investors hear this, but honestly, it's like the truth. If I were to do things differently, I would have stayed in the Bay Area, where I did my MBA. Things changed. Like I didn't even know I was starting a startup at that point, but it would have been more vital to be in the coast. Hence, part of the reason why I was at New York a couple weeks ago, building out some of the network there. Something that once you start doesn't really stop. But something that I would do is, regardless of what city you're in, I would find, and there's a couple ways you can do this. You can find this on Twitter, obviously. You can find it on LinkedIn. But look at like what tech hubs exist in your city. And when you do some digging, you do some research, you'll evidently find the 2 to 3 people that you need to know. Get in front of those 2 to 3 people, get a meeting with them, build a relationship with them, because that's one of the fastest way to build your network. And this is something that I'd say I think I ended up doing accidentally. Like there are probably 2 hubs like in Chicago for what I'm building that have been super beneficial. Connecting with kind of like those hubs. So I'll go ahead and like share that. If you are building in Chicago, I think 2 of the biggest hubs that you need to know are World Business Chicago, phenomenal leadership team. What they're doing is like making waves for a super small team across the city, hosting multiple summits, being very just kind and humble people, which you don't get that all the time, especially when you start.
That's a very networking. Chicago thing. Yeah, that's a very Midwest situation.
Well,
not
fronts,
so
necessarily.
that doesn't surprise me. No,
I think no. So quite the opposite. I've actually met a lot of very arrogant people in Chicago. Again, you can quote me. I don't care. It's like the
breaking
reality.
Stereotypes. I love it. So you're not a native Chicagoan, so you're allowed to dump on the city. Oh my gosh.
No, I am.
They're gonna run you out of town.
No, I am a native Chicagoan.
Okay.
Yeah, so I feel like it's better
so you
enough
are allowed.
to say.
I take it back. Okay.
Yeah. But so WBC, phenomenal. The other is Polsky, and this one can be a bit harder to get into. This one almost requires like ancillary, like networking to get into. Polsky is this entrepreneurship center based out of University of Chicago. So down in Hyde Park, they are launching a variety of programs. They often have just essentially like free access, like networking nights, just to get like your feet wet. And I find that if you go to one of them, you'll get on this like listserv and then you'll get invited to go to all of them. And I think what's important though is when you start getting invited to like networking events, being very, very intentional, because it's one thing to go to like 5 different happy hour events every single week and think you're making progress, when in reality you're probably just having 7 to 10 like 30-second one-off conversations, and that amounting to anything probably is like unlikely. So being very intentional. I don't do this as often anymore, but at the beginning I go to like at least like one event per week, and my goal was to have 2 to 3 in-depth conversations with 2 to 3 specific people. And if that happened, then that was like a successful day, and there are any follow-ups that kind of happen. I'd work on that and developing a relationship beyond that. Otherwise, you just kind of get stuck into this like fake, what's like the word I'm looking for? fake productive cycle where you
But
think you're being
everyone knows
productive.
it.
Yeah.
Everyone's felt that at the happy hour circuit. I used to, so, before the pandemic, before starting day one, which is what I'm working on now, I was at a venture studio, and so audience, you may or may not know this, Karishma, I don't know if you know this, but it was in New York, and very much like one of these hubs, in the sense that it wasn't like on the map per se, right? I think it was kind of like these where if you just like looked a little bit, you would know that like there was a happy hour every, one Thursday a month, and like. And then there's many of these. New York is now like a really, really, really big scene. But like back in like 2017, 2018, it was so much bigger than it was. It was still definitely on the up and pretty large. But there was definitely a known few places to go. But you could totally get lost in just like whatever, just drinking, right? Or just hanging out and just whatever. Versus making any real connections. And so, yeah, if you're super intentional, and you have to be intentional. And I'm thinking about it now. I'm like, if you go in and you like know one person, just be like, get me in front of the next person, right? Make the one connection, and I'll meet them in person now, because I love your advice. This is so good. I'm like just remembering back to like my days of breaking into venture, and there's like no substitute for these things, right?
Yeah.
And they're both long game plays, right? This isn't about like, I'm sure you have like pieces of advice around like, if you're going to go fundraise, your list needs to be like, I'll throw out a number, 300 people big, right? Plus or minus around there, right? Like you can't be too much smaller than that. It can't be 30 people. It can't be 50, right? No way.
No. Yeah, I think it used to be, this is what I've been told from friends who launched companies, basically like pre 2022. They're like, you could have a list of like 60 people. You get probably like 15 meetings. At those 15 meetings, you get maybe like 5 that deployed capital. Now it's literally like around that point, I feel like 200 or 300. So, and I guess like quick notes on how to streamline that, at least like how I've been doing it. Did a lot of research. So for me, it was looking at people that backed companies in the similar kind of like niche that I'm in, finding what funds like backed them at that same stage, making a massive Excel sheet, literally going on LinkedIn then and seeing who I knew that was some degree of separation from them. Looking at what the check size was. And this is also really important, not just with their check size. When was their last check? I literally had a call with an investor like 2 weeks ago who said they were interested in my company, but the last time they deployed capital was in February of 2023. So making sure that lines up too. And the only way you're going to know that is if you actually ask that question. So just being very transparent about where you're at and where they're at is super helpful. And then once you have like this master Excel sheet, then you go back to the people that you've networked with, back to the people you built these relationships with, and you send them individualized like emails, attach your Calendly to it, see if they have some 20, 30 minutes just to chat and to see what you're building with. And then in that way, what you're doing is you're basically giving all of these highly networked individuals that you've now built a relationship with this Excel sheet, so they're able to vouch for you and send warm introductions. Because I think now, I've heard of some people being able to raise just by filling out like an Airtable cold, but the reality is I do think a lot of this world is very warm connection driven, and the more you're able to do that, the more people you're able to get to vouch for you. It's only gonna help your odds. Like I think I sent out probably like 62 messages today trying to connect to 62 different people through my own network. So it like never stops.
You're doing it so right. I love this. Anyone listening, if you're ever thinking like, should I spend $500 on a fundraising course? They're just going to tell you what Karishma just told you. Literally. That was a masterclass in 60 seconds. You've nailed it, right? There's steps to these. Like the art in there is like, you got to be real. You have to, like actually build a relationship. You can't be transactional on that call, even as you're asking for help, right? But if you've done the legwork and then you do that, structured process, you're right. There's those like, we hear about the myth of like the process that yields like a competitive, term sheets and they're bidding on you. Like that is 1 in 1,000 companies.
That's like if you went to Stanford or you went to Harvard, like, yeah, you're going to get that. But if you didn't, unfortunately, and it's not even you have to be more calculated.
Vast majority, like the people I generally hang out with, right? Even super smart people who are going to build things who've been in tech, like you, like me, like we raised money. It was not fast and easy, right? It is always a slog, right? And so you have to be ready. And yeah, first checks are the hardest, so it's always a grind. Oh my gosh. Before we get into a pity party about how annoying fundraising is, let's end on a high note, because that was such an amazing piece of advice, or 2 or 3 nuggets there, Karishma. I'm really glad I went there because I was right. This was very front of mind for you. You're in the game. Here, let's close out like this. I want to make sure everyone listening knows where to find you and find Drip. So give us the call to action. Where should people go to get involved, pre-order, whatever they can do?
Ooh, awesome. You can find us anywhere. So our website is www.dripco.us. If you're interested in being on the wait list or even pre-ordering one of these that professional and collegiate athletes will be using, you can do so there. We are on LinkedIn as Drip Co. We're on Twitter and Instagram, and now TikTok at what are we? Wearable. So come check us out there. If you happen to be a D1 athlete who's interested in being an ambassador, give me a ping if you are interested in getting involved in one of our running communities and you're a runner. Also look us up. Strava is the last one, actually. Strava is Drip Tech as well. Drip Hydration Tech. There's so many drips. Always lose track. So yeah. Come check us out, join our communities, join on the fun.
That's right. And stay tuned. If you're an athlete, if you're a pro, if you're a D1 athlete, if you're that prosumer, get involved, stay in the know. Karishma, thank you so much for this conversation. Really fun to learn about Drip. Really, really excited for what you're building. And thanks for sharing so much advice. This was a really good one. So we'll end it there. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for listening.
Awesome. Thanks for having me again, Andrew. This is so much fun.
All right. Amazing. All right. Bye, everyone. Bye, Karishma.
The Backseat Startup Podcast is brought to you by StartupStage, formerly known as Startup Founder Daily. StartupStage is the place to showcase your startup and compete for features across our channels. Each week, users can vote for their favorite startups. The top 3 companies, as determined by the votes, are then selected for special features across our blog, podcast, newsletter, and social media platforms. Hit the link in the description below to apply.